So what do we know about Virgil's intention, the moral intention? So I'm put in brackets piety here, and I think there's a question in the chat there that I missed, but I see some people jumped in about what is piety. So thank you, and thanks for those responding. And we'll get to a definition of piety, or Virgil's definition of piety, but basically let's think of it as dutiful, being dutiful in relationship to all of one's duties. Okay, so piety can sometimes have a sense of just performing, let's say, religious duties. It's sometimes, in our sense, our modern sense, it's sometimes, someone's pious if they revere God, whoever their religious higher power, so to speak, is. However, in Virgil's context, it had a broader meaning. Let us say performing one's duties to all of those to whom one had a duty. So one has a duty as a father to the family, okay, let us say, or as a mother to the family. One has a duty as a son or a daughter to the rest of the family. One has a duty as a public participant to do their civic duty, let us say, whether it's their role in a club, their role in their role as part of a defense force, their role as their job in an administrative role, what have you. One has a duty to the gods, to perform sacrifice, to perform rituals. So if you're a pious individual, one puts their duties to their family above their own interests. One puts their duties to the community above their own interests. One puts their duties to the gods before their own interests. One always thinks about those duties and how they have to sacrifice their own sense of well-being for those duties. So I think, I guess maybe a virtue that we could all use in the modern world, driven by let's say individual competition and greed, the modern liberal republic, so to speak. So one question then is, if this, what is Virgil's moral intention? Okay, so I'm saying that I'll give as a short answer to that is, I think, instilling piety to some extent, but we'll go through what some of the ins and outs of this question are. So one assumption has been that the poem is in a way kind of a piece of Augustan propaganda, that there's all these civil wars, and that luckily Aeneid comes along and provides order, just like Augustus provide order after our period of civil wars. Okay, so there's that sense. And as I mentioned here, Augustus brought peace to the Roman world, closing the gates of Janus, signifying bringing of peace in 31 BCE for the first time after a century of civil war. And in the Wednesday lecture, we'll go over a bit of that, about that context of the civil wars. So Augustus, like Aeneid, brings peace after a lengthy and bloody struggle. However, more recently, some critics, so in the last, I would say, 3 decades, have seen a strain within the poem that criticizes the rule of Augustus. So maybe on the face of it, it looks like Virgil's playing ball and saying what is politically convenient because Augustus is in power, and Augustus wants a poem that's obviously going to put him in a good light. And maybe on the surface, Virgil plays ball, but underneath, maybe there, for the subtle eye, for someone with a critical perspective, they can see a critique of that rule. So what's in the chat here? Hiding criticisms in a nice story. Yes, of course, good one. Yes, thanks, Melody, for that. It's true. Yes, so hiding truths in a sugary pill, so to speak. So here in this thread of criticism, this thread of analysis, let's say, what seemed to be happening in the poem is an emphasis on the burden of Rome. And here, these let's say critics, these more recent critics will highlight the Dido story I mentioned, like maybe we're supposed to sympathize with Dido, and maybe, maybe Aeneas was cold to have abandoned Dido. So they'll emphasize all these points where, let's say, the burden or molus of Rome is at play. So one is the treatment of Dido. Another episode is at the end of book 6. Remember, I mentioned that in book 6, Aeneas descends into the underworld. And as he's exiting the underworld, he's given this vision. First of all, he's given this vision of the greatness of the line of Roman rulers that will descend from him leading up to Augustus, and how these are, this is all going to be great. However, as he's exiting, he's given this choice of well, it's not a choice, but we are told that he exits via the gates of ivory, and the gates of ivory indicate the gate of false dreams, as opposed to let's say true dreams. So one way of looking at that is that this Roman future that he's just seen is a false dream, is, let's say, a lie that the Romans tell themselves, that this was good, that what happened, all this Roman conquering and this conquering of their enemies and this powerful rule that they've developed. And then the other thing that is often pointed to is this treatment, well, how Aeneas becomes Achilles in his most rage-driven, and the final scene we see is of him killing Turnus. Now remember, Achilles in Homer kills Hector, of course. That's not the final word on Achilles. Achilles is great not because he killed Hector, I would submit, but Achilles is a great hero because of the profound insight he has towards our condition as mortals, right? And his acceptance of mortality in book 24. We don't see that in the Aeneid for Aeneas. So that would be a critical perspective on let's say the Augustan propaganda, so to speak. In my view, and you're invited to critically assess what you read and come up with your own view. You don't have to obviously parrot my view. I just want to put my cards on the table. What I think is that the moral center is this piety, and that the Roman way of life, the same type of life that Augustus was trying to revitalize in Rome. And I think it can be seen as a celebration of the rule of Augustus, maybe not Augustan propaganda, but I think a celebration of that rule after 100 years of civil war. And, civil war, it's just one of the most horrible things, and they had lived through 100 years of that. And any sign of, okay, well, someone's bringing peace and order is nothing to be scoffed at, and nothing to be seen lightly. And I think Virgil did see a certain, let's say, meaningful end to or purpose in the rule of Augustus, and a purpose to the Roman mission that Augustus would be furthering. I think Virgil believed that they needed to recenter Roman life on their duty to the gods, duty to country, duty to family and friends, which had been kind of torn apart by the Civil War. And in this system, we see it in the Aeneid. That system of duty puts tension between individual private experience and the duty that they must perform in public. But that doesn't discredit the fact that duty is there and is a noble ideal. Okay. So piety, so this dutifulness, is presented in tension with madness or furor. So in Latin, piety is pietas, okay, and it's let's say contrasted with furor. So furor is this kind of form of madness that can take a couple of forms. One is amor, passion, like love in the sense of a passion or desire. And we see that in book 4. Obviously, his pietas, his dutiful mission, is challenged or threatened in book 4 by potentially being overcome by amor, like a madness in the form of a passionate or desiring attachment to Dido. And then the other form it can take is ira or ira, which is kind of savage anger or rage. So remember, the beginning of the Iliad is manus or rage. So to here, rage in the form of ira takes a big part of the story, and we see it, let's say the second half of the Aeneid, where, as I mentioned, after Pallas is killed by Turnus, Aeneas, like Achilles, becomes driven by this rage and anger in the form of wanting to take revenge on Turnus. Also, much of the story is driven by Juno's implacable rage. So Juno is the equivalent of Hera. So is the Roman equivalent of Hera. Remember, Hera was one of the jilted goddesses following the judgment of Paris, right? So Hera and Athena had never been kind toward the Trojans, and Hera in particular, and in her Roman form, Juno, spends the whole epic trying to thwart Aeneas's mission.